right now, let's talk about Neutron. Please welcome General Manager at Neutron, Avril Dutheil.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Avril. I'm the General Manager at Neutron. If you've been around crypto Twitter for like the last year, you've probably heard about it because Neutron is the first replicated security chain. It launched on the Cosmos Hub a few weeks ago now, and so we're going to start with a quick debrief of the progress so far and sort of like the next steps for Neutron. So, as I mentioned, Neutron started with a proposal on the Cosmos Hub, Prop 72, which proposed to help replicated security go to market by building interesting projects to it and helping them launch, basically. That's when we proposed launching a DeFi hub, which since then has evolved a lot. We've conducted multiple audits. We've released about half a dozen of testnets since then. And then in May this year, we actually made the final proposal, launched mainnet, and now the launch event is, I think, minutes away from ending. And so let's take a second to talk about that. Neutron's ecosystem hasn't really launched yet, and yet we've been able to bootstrap about $15 million of liquidity, which essentially will make Astroport on Neutron as big as all of the other deployments of Astroport in Cosmos today before it even launched. Some of that liquidity is also locked, about 40% of the Atom liquidity and 20% of the USDC liquidity, although this number might have changed a little bit since they constantly evolve until the end of the event very soon. And so, the point was to try and bootstrap from the get-go a functional ecosystem. Our take on this, right, as a smart contract platform, a very important aspect and something that's a little bit different from AppChain is that we have the product, like the platform itself, but we also need the ecosystem as a whole to actually, be functional and interesting to participate in. And so our approach has been to say there's a few numbers of like strategic Lego pieces that you need to have in order to have the ability to build all of these use cases that people are excited about and for the ecosystem to be functional. That includes DEXs, the ability to trade, the ability to take on leverage, to have sort of like stable assets. And we've, paid a lot of attention to try and make sure that all of these primitives were available on Neutron sort of like as soon as possible. And so as you can see, we have pretty bold and interesting protocols in sort of like all of these verticals that are in the process right now of launching or are already live. For example, if we want to take like trading, you'll be able to trade on Neutron in the next few hours. Astroport is launching. Cosmos Swap is another version of it where it's going to be an outpost from an existing app chain. Stargaze will do the same. And so over the next few months, we expect to see a pretty interesting ecosystem starting to appear on Neutron. The point here being that once you have these sort of like pieces, you can start building additional use cases and composing these, right? That's the beauty of DeFi in our ecosystem, in our industry, right? And so we've got a collection here of, I think, about 38 of the protocols that have already committed to supporting Neutron. And now that begs the question, okay, we have this initial ecosystem coming together over the next few months. We have a little bit of liquidity. Now, what's next from the perspective of like ecosystem development? Well, first we need to grow that liquidity to ensure that all of these primitives can be functional and store people that get in and out of them as they please. We need to structure funding mechanisms and streams in order to ensure that new participants that join the ecosystem are able to sort of get rewarded and supported for their contributions. And we need to work on onboarding new teams and diversifying the set of participants. Let's start with growing liquidity. Currently in Cosmos, one of the main ways that this is handled is let's think about something, put a proposal on the forum, discuss it a little bit, then put it on chain, vote for about 2 weeks on it, and once that vote passes, it transfers tokens to a system or a multi-sig that will actually disburse it. The process is a bit slow. It can lead to voter fatigue, and it doesn't really adjust well with sort of like the market, the circumstances around. It doesn't necessarily take into account other programs that were decided before. And so how about we try and automate some of that? When we designed Neutron, we actually built a system that's a bit more modular, thanks in part to DAO's great work on, on governance systems, I would say. And so you have sort of like the traditional architecture of having a DAO composed of a lot of voters that are able to obtain voting power by bonding tokens. Here we're not talking about staking because Neutron as a consumer chain doesn't have a staking module, but bonding, there's no lockup because it's not required in this case. And in exchange, you get voting power, and that voting power allows you to control the blockchain and to control the treasury, which is the Neutron equivalent of the community pool. Now, we also built another system, which instead of having all of the tokens sort of liquid and waiting to be spent somewhere, these tokens are actually locked up, and they're released gradually over time based on on-chain activity. So the more activity there is on Neutron, the more transaction fees, and the more Neutron tokens are burnt as part of these transaction fees. Now, based on how much NTRN is burnt, more or less NTRN is released by the reserve. Before it ends in the treasury, where it's just gonna wait around to be spent, it goes through the distribution module. And what that module does is, you can think about it as a switch, right? Where do we want the tokens to go over time as they're released? The base option, which is currently the configuration, is we just send them to the treasury and we'll find a use case for them later. But we can also decide, hey, let's send them to a specific address or a specific module. In this case, we could make a liquidity module. You probably will recognize some already established liquidity management model, but basically, we can have a module here that contains gauges that correspond to various pools that are on Neutron, and people can vote into these gauges to sort of like guide the allocation of the tokens that are received over time from the reserve to these various pools. And now we can also lock the, we can opt into locking the voting vaults that give you the voting power in order to modulate sort of like the influence that you have on these gauges. This is very similar to the VE tokenomics with a few differences, including the fact, for example, that in Curve, you can only lock like CRV, whereas in Neutron, because voting vaults allow you to actually represent grant voting power to a wide variety of tokens and derivatives, you can actually get that voting power by providing liquidity, right? And so you start getting that sort of feedback cycle of I provide lock some liquidity into the system, thereby strengthening the economy of the platform, and I get more voting power for it, which allows me to participate in allocating the incentives across all of the pools, including the one that I'm using to get voting power for. And so I'm getting governance rewards, as well as incentives, trading fees, voting power, all in the same package, right? Now, the beauty of the system is that because of the reserve system, it adjusts with the market conditions over time, right? So the more activity there is on Neutron, the more incentives we can afford, the stronger the economy is going to be, and the more it can absorb. Whereas when we go into more bear market sort of conditions, the program will naturally sort of like ramp down to avoid sort of diluting the economy and having exhausting demand basically and leading to these sort of like crashes. Now the second sort of vertical that we need to care about in developing this ecosystem is sort of making sure that the right mechanisms are in place for contributors to access funding. Traditionally in Cosmos today, the way it's done is can be broken down into two categories. The first one is via governance proposals. Doing so is very transparent. Everybody contributes to the decision, so it's very democratic as well. But the problem is that it's pretty slow. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be consistent, because from one proposal to the other, the way that people evaluate projects and how much money they should get can evolve. Or we often structure it through multisig, right? So as an intermediary, we give a lot of money to a committee that's mostly off-chain that will make these decisions on behalf of the DAO, right? Now, what if, this system is pretty good because it can be more consistent, it can be more efficient, more faster, and therefore provide a better experience to the applicants, the grantees. But the problem is that it's less transparent, right? You only see the final transaction, you don't know what people actually did as due diligence before they actually allocated that money. So now, how about we combine these two mechanisms into one, e.g. getting the efficiency and accountability of these two systems into one primitive, and can we find other mechanisms to provide funding in an efficient way? our approach was to essentially try and match the needs with the solutions, right? So for what we usually call grants, we created what we call the grant sub-DAO, which is essentially a set of smart contracts that allow you to have a fully on-chain committee that is fully transparent, but still has this sort of like flexibility that committees have. For other needs, like for example, tooling and public funding, which often doesn't get as much hype as other sort of like application type of projects, we have other mechanisms that can help support them. And then finally, it's not just about money. Sometimes your team needs different types of support, and so we can have other initiatives as well gravitating around the ecosystem to help you sort of like get where you need to be. Now, let's take 5 minutes to talk about the GRANTSDAO. So we've described this system just before, right, where we have users who can get voting power by bonding into your own tokens, and through this, they are able to vote in the main DAO. Now, we can make a proposal to the main DAO to create an entity that it will control, but that will have autonomy. So, for example, we make a proposal to create a sub-DAO that will perform grants. We send some funds to it in the same transaction, and we get this sort of like independent entity. Now, one of the things that we've put in place in order to make sure that these would remain aligned with the main governance is we implemented a time lock mechanism. So how does it work? You have a good team coming in and making an application. Hey, we're building X, and we would like to get some funding to help us get there, right? The sub-DAO sort of like does their due diligence, they review it, they produce sort of like a memo, they submit it to the vote, and they are the one voting on it, right? Just like in a multi-sig, not every token holder has to vote, right? So we're not yet bothering the entire DAO for this decision. Now, the grant proposal is approved by the sub-DAO, right? But before it actually gets executed and funds are sent, it's first time-locked for 3 days. And during that period, anyone in the main DAO can review that proposal and the result that it got, and if they don't agree with it, they can contribute their voting power to censor, to overrule the decision of the sub-DAO. So here, we have a good team applying for a good grant, everything's fine, the main DAO looks at it, okay, it looks good, we're not doing anything, it just gets executed after 3 days, right? Which is much faster than the traditional sort of like 2 weeks governance process. Now, what happens if there's a bad team coming in and sort of self-dealing or stealing funds or being a scam project? Well, basically the same, right? Imagine the sub-DAO doesn't catch the fact that the team is actually not that solid, shouldn't get a grant, or whatever the situation may be, right? They still vote for that proposal to pass. Now, the main DAO looks at it, does their own due diligence, and says like, no, we don't want to fund this, actually. So during the time lock period, the main DAO can come in and with just a small portion of the voting power, force that proposal to be cancelled, essentially. Now, if in that case, if you still wanted the grant to happen, you could submit it to the main DAO to be reviewed by absolutely everyone as a fallback, or it just doesn't happen. And in that case, you've prevented the sub-DAO from acting wrongly or maliciously. In the worst case scenario, where the sub-DAO itself is not mistaken, but actually malicious, let's say they make a proposal to steal all of the money, the main DAO remains the admin. And so what the main DAO can do is simply to dissolve the sub-DAO and reclaim all of the funds, right? So if you try to secede from the governing body of the network can react and sort of like evacuate you just like an immune system would. Now, this system can actually be adapted to a whole lot of use cases, right? You can have sub-DAOs that are dedicated to, furthering best security practices, sponsoring audits to sort of like make the entire ecosystem more resilient. You can have sub-DAOs that are, focused on providing and processing information on behalf of the community, sponsoring sort of like content creation. We can have GRANTSDAO, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is still very much led by people, and still a lot of it is off-chain. How about if we made fully on-chain mechanisms that use the market to sort of guide funding to the best projects, right? Well, you probably are familiar with Gitcoin, who pioneered quadratic funding. Well, we can bring this to Neutron and Cosmos, right? Now, combining this with the reserve and distribution module primitives, we can essentially have a matching pool that fills up over time and that uses quadratic funding to essentially match these funds with donations from the community that are used to essentially identify the most interesting projects. The way quadratic funding works is that it makes a balance between efficiency and decentralization. E.g., here in this example, you can see that 4 people are contributing $1 to project A, and 1 person is contributing $4 to project B. Yet project A is getting a lot more matching funds than project B is. And the reason for that is the quadratic function sort of like values the number of contributions and contributors also over sort of like the scope of the contribution of the individual contributions. In general, this is something that has been tremendously useful, for example, in the Ethereum ecosystem to fund public good, infrastructure, tooling projects, all of the things that are absolutely crucial for a lively ecosystem, but don't always get sort of like the hype that would generate the ability to get large grants from governance or funding entities. Now, I realized that I've actually rushed through this talk. Initially I had 42 slides, so I trimmed it down a bit because I was concerned of wasting your time. I hope I haven't. But just before I leave this stage, I'll just touch on one last thing that we're currently working on, which is we're proposing to put together this accelerator program for the Atom Economic Zone. So you may have heard about the concept of the Atom Economic Zone, which is essentially the idea that the Cosmos Hub plus the collection of consumer chains that share the same validator set and security can deeply integrate economically and politically. And furthering that idea, making it real, is something that we're actively working on to generate collaborations between existing and future consumer chains and the Cosmos Hub. So we propose to have a 6-month accelerator program and builder fellowship for 25 to 30 startups, which would therefore receive support for building on Neutron or their own consumer chains from the Atom Accelerator DAO, from Neutron, as well as from Longhash, which has been running accelerator programs for various networks, including Axelar and Polkadot. And the 5 highest potential startup will get funding from either Neutron or the Atom Accelerator DAO, depending on where they're building, as well as sort of like a fully structured curriculum to sort of like help them get their project to the next step, essentially. So if that's something that's interesting to you, look out for the proposal, which should be on the Neutron governance today, probably. And once that's, if that's something that's you think is likely to bring value to the Neutron ecosystem and you have some voting power in there, go on and vote. Thanks for listening to me. I hope that was interesting to you, and have a good day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.